Hello and welcome to Module 2, learning more about feedback and feed forward. And my name is Jackie Stavros, and I'm going to take you through this module, which is applying the two appreciative practices. So let me share my screen with you. So welcome again to Feedback Feed Forward from an appreciative perspective, lesson 2.4. Our agenda for the next 15-20 minutes that we're going to spend together is looking at how to give appreciatively feedback and feed forward, exploring the nature of our conversations that we have in giving feedback and feed forward and its impact. Learn two simple practices that can be applied in giving feedback and feed forward. And these two practices will be positive framing and generative questions. And you should have received a workbook, a very short workbook, about 9 pages that you can use to follow along in this presentation. So I'd like you to think of feedback and feed forward, that they're gifts that you get to help people to do better and to improve, and that it's an exchange that goes back and forth. So if you're looking at your workbook here, just go over to page 2. And I want to think about the nature of our feedback and the type of conversations you may have with people that you're given feedback and feed forward to. And there's 2 lines that it operates on, is when we give feedback that's appreciative, that shows value to the person, value to the situation, whereas depreciative can tend to devalue the person and the situation. So we want to really make sure that we practice feedback that is appreciative. And when you're giving feedback, you typically give feedback in statements of telling people what you think of their work. And sometimes you ask questions. So what we want to try to get you to do is to have conversations with feedback that are what I like to call above the line, that it's appreciative in nature and it's very affirmative, and that you're beginning to ask questions. And if you ever want to dive deeper into this, you can look at the book Conversations Worth Having. But this presentation today should help you learn how to use the 2 simple practices. So what I want you to do for a moment is, and you can flip over to page 3 in your workbook, I just want you to think about the power of the conversations. When you're interacting with people and you're giving feedback and feed forward or any conversation, I want you to just close your eyes for a moment and think about a conversation that was critical and where somebody was giving you feedback or asking questions that felt critical, or it was really destructive. Just close your eyes and think about that feedback or feed forward situation, or maybe it's something that a colleague shared with you. I want you to notice what happens in your body and kind of just jot that down on your workbook. But usually when you're in a depreciative, destructive, or critical conversation, whether it's feedback or feed forward, your body tenses up, you might get a headache, you might be stressed out, but normally your well-being is impacted in a negative way. And it's not such a great thing, is it? But now, I want to take you away. And I want to ask you about a great conversation. I want you to think about when somebody was giving you feedback or feed forward and you were delighted, you were excited, you knew what to do. In the situation, you knew how to move forward. And I want you to notice how that feels in your body. So there's a difference between appreciative feedback and feed forward and depreciative feedback and feed forward. And you can really begin to feel it in your mind and in your heart and in your whole body. So this module, this lesson, is about how do you give feedback and feed forward using the 2 appreciative inquiry practices. So in your workbook, look at page 4. There's some definitions. Feedback is information, and it's about reactions or comments to a person or a team's performance. We've all probably heard or been in situations where feedback can be appreciative or depreciative. But today we're going to talk about how to make it appreciative. And feed forward is when somebody gives insights and ideas to enhance yours or a team's performance. And what we're going to focus on is how to do this from an appreciative inquiry perspective. First, I want to think about when something triggers you and you find yourself in that depreciative space, either when somebody's talking to you in a feedback feed forward situation or you're giving feedback and feed forward, you want to make sure that you are above the line. So I just want you to learn a simple, I like to call it a strategy or a technique, and just take a moment and pause and try to understand. Take a deep breath and get really curious. I want you to think about this. If you're learning to want to give feedback that is efficient and effective and motivates somebody and shows them how to do, that you really want to come from a perspective of appreciative inquiry. And this is about two practices, how you can frame feedback and how you can give feed forward from a positive frame and asking generative questions. And this next slide here is about polarize, considering conversations worth having. If you really want to understand the importance of positive framing and generative questions in any conversations, and sometimes when you wish you could redo a feed forward or feedback or an evaluation situation, I want you can go to this website here, or in your workbook, you can just go to my Twitter at Jackie Stavros, Jackie Stavros, and just download this article from Forbes that really dives you deeper into these two practices. So you probably heard about appreciative inquiry. I just want to touch upon it very briefly to say that appreciation and to be appreciative is adding value and valuing what people want in the situation. And inquiry is asking questions about being curious, wanting to really help people, wanting to search for what generates life, what is somebody doing forward. So in this lesson, we boil it down to these two practices. And this is just some information if you want to learn more about appreciative inquiry. But let's talk about the first practice, and you can be on page 6 in your workbook, is how do you create a positive frame? And sometimes you have to go in when it's time to give a person feedback and think about the complaint or the negative impact. And what is it that you really, what's the positive opposite? What do you really want more of? But you want to be able to frame it in a way, when you thought about your great conversations, that has a positive impact, and it invites them and motivates them and it inspires them to do well. So that's what this example is going to be about here. So positive framing is doing just that. And an example, if you look on your workbook on page 6, that I like to talk about is somebody who's always late. And somebody on your team is always late to your meetings, or they're distracted in your meetings. And you want to ask yourself, you're going to name the problem. Jackie's always late. Well, the positive opposite is easy. Jackie's on time. But we really want to talk about if Jackie's on time to these meetings, what's going to be happening? What is this relationship going to look like? How much more productive? How much more efficient can we be? So if the positive opposite in the middle, the yellow, if the flip it was true, what we really want to talk about is giving Jackie feedback and feed forward on what it means to be a productive, efficient, and effective team member. And those are the types of conversations, and that's what positive framing is about. Positive framing is talking more about what you want to happen, more about what you want to see, more about what happens when Jackie's on time to her meeting. So that's the first practice. The second practice is questions. And if you think about this, if you learn to ask generative questions, questions that open up the mind, questions that make what's invisible visible to people, it deepens our understanding. We begin to point out strengths. and best practices and we generate possibilities, these are questions that really get into what is feed forward and how do you really ask questions that help people figure out a path forward. Generative questions can shift a mindset. And if you go on page 8 in your workbook, there are generative questions to ask in a feedback session, such as, so tell me more about how you did this. Tell me more about this report you're working on. And then you could ask a question, is there anybody else on our team or in another department who has tackled this situation? And how might they be of help to us? I wonder what else is possible. The types of questions that generative questions are questions that connect us to each other, questions that help us explore what's right, what's possible, how others are doing things. My favorite generative question when I'm in a situation giving feedback or feed forward to somebody is asking someone simply what are their wishes? What would they like to see happen? So I think generative questions are very powerful. They can actually naturally flip the situation to a positive frame. And generative questions give life to a situation. And in the world of appreciative inquiry, think of these two practices, positive framing and generative questions, as a way to help people grow and have a learner's mindset and understand what did they do well and what can they do better and what else is possible. And so in a feedback and a feed forward situation, we want a conversation worth having where we're going back and forth and we're learning to ask generative questions and positively frame. So I want you to remember when you receive feedback, listen, just always take that deep breath and ask clarifying questions or generative questions if you're on the receiving end of the feedback to generate a conversation where you actually know more of what you should be doing and how do you do it better and how do you do it in a way that they may want. And always accept with gratitude and simply say, thank you for your feedback. Now, if you're giving feedback, always remember to give feedback in the moment and ask yourself, can you use positive framing? And if you tell them what you're looking for or what they're doing right, that's going to help them. If you tell people what's wrong and what they can't do, it's going to put them in that protect mode and shut them down. And even if you gave them feed forward, they're not going to be able to help you. So you want to give feedback always in the moment, but use a positive frame and generative questions. And you really want to be specific in your feedback. You want to clarify and reinforce the actions that you're looking for. Again, that positive framing is what are you looking for, not what you're not looking for. And you can be honest and supportive, and you can give feedback that's respectful and kind. Most people know what feedback is, and it's telling people how to improve. But you need to think about giving feedback in a way that's positively framing and asking generative questions. Feed forward is really helping people and engaging in a conversation to see beyond what it is they're doing well and now what else is possible. And feed forward can be telling people what you like and what's working well, but feed forward is telling them, what are my suggestions to make it even better? So as I take down these slides here, you have a little workbook that gives you an opportunity to revisit the concepts that were just introduced in this lesson. And there's a summary on the last page of your workbook. And in the summary, it just asks you 3 things to practice. The first one is to be really aware about how are you giving feedback and feed forward. And are you giving it in a way that's putting people into a connect mode so that they can listen to the feedback, but engage in a conversation and do even better and new things and different things that neither of you ever thought of alone. The second practice we talked about was positive framing. And positive framing, putting a positive frame to your feedback and your feed forward sessions, is going to be talking about what you want instead of what you don't want, and what's possible instead of what cannot be done. And it's finding ways to reinforce the practice of giving feedback and feed forward that's generating where we all feel good, well, and connected, productive, and efficient. And then the second practice is generative questions, and there's a summary in your workbook there. And generative questions is when you look for the opportunity, if you're the person giving feedback and feed forward, think about the tone and direction of your conversations. Even before you go into a feedback session with somebody, think about, what do I know? What am I assuming? How do I make this a productive feedback session? And how do we both lead with feed forward so that we're both doing better in our jobs and serving our team? And remember that your questions need to come from an appreciative space. They need to value the person and the situation. Feedback is all about improving performance of the person and the team, and also considering what else is possible. And you want to motivate people. So I want you guys to think about these two practices, positive framing and generative questions. They're the heart of appreciative inquiry, and how you can use them to have good feedback and feed forward sessions.